down, as I mentioned earlier, into these 39 books. And this was their scripture. They never included the apocryphal books. The books are never mentioned by Jesus or his apostles. They didn't use them. These books were never accepted by first century Jewish writers such as Josephus or Philo. They do not accept them as scripture. It was not accepted by the Jewish Council of Jamnia in AD 90, which again addressed what are the books of scripture. The 39 books. And they were not accepted by the early Christian writers, by Jerome, who translated the Latin Vulgate and maintained that these books were apocryphal and were to be included, and were not to be included in the canon of Scripture. Why were the apocryphal books removed? Well, these books do not seem to be inspired, since they contain numerous historical, chronological, or geographical errors. Also, these books were ruled to be canonical. I mean, they were not considered scripture until April 8, 1546, which was done by the fourth section of the Council of Trent of the Roman Catholic Church, and this was done as a direct response to the Reformation. They called them the deuterocanonical books, meaning secondary canon. Now, why in 1546? Why are these suddenly going to be considered scripture? Well, again, it comes out of the Reformation. The Reformers had some distinct problems with what the Roman Catholic Church was doing at that time. One of those things was the selling of indulgences and the concept of the treasury of merits. That, you could buy forgiveness of sins for yourself and for others. People that were in purgatory. Now, if you look in the Old Testament and you look in the New Testament, you do not see references to purgatory. But the reference to purgatory is found in the apocryphal books. It's found in 2 Maccabees 12, 43 to 46, where Joseph Maccabeus writes that he sent 12,000 drachmas of silver to Jerusalem for sacrifice to be offered for the sins of the dead, thinking well and religiously concerning the resurrection, for if he had not hoped that they that were slain should rise again, it would have seemed superfluous and vain to pray for the dead. And because he considered that they who had fallen asleep with godliness had great grace laid up for them, it is therefore a holy and wholesome thought to pray for the dead, that they may be loosed from their sins. You see, they go to this one individual who offered a sacrifice for dead people to make atonement for their sins so that they would be in heaven. And though that's never mentioned before in the Old Testament, Jesus never mentions anything about it. The evangelists, the apostles, never mention anything about it. It did make for a great money-making scheme back in the Middle Ages. And the Reformers stood up to it and said it's not right. And it is then that at that time they were made scripture, because it backed up one of their teachings, which was leading to the selling of indulgences and the treasury of merits, which again was done by money. You could buy the merits of a saint to apply to someone in your family who had died, who you didn't think was in heaven, but was in purgatory, a place where their sins were being purged and they were being cleansed. You could get them out earlier. Now that's going to lead to some questions. Well, aren't there other apocryphal books, those New Testament apocryphal books, the lost Gospels and all? I'm going to say this as clearly as I can say this. There never were any New Testament apocryphal books. Books referred to as this in modern times, and I have to stress that, modern times. It isn't until the 20th century that people start talking about the lost Gospels. And it really wasn't big until 1982, when there was a book put out about Holy Blood, Holy Grail, which is where Dan Brown gets his whole idea for this Da Vinci Code thing. But there it makes this claim that there's these Gospels. These were considered heretical by the early church fathers. Again, the early church fathers, Ignatius, Polycarp, Irenaeus, Justin Martyr, when these books started being written later, in the 2nd and 3rd and even 4th century, the early church fathers said, no, these are not Scripture. They weren't written by the apostles. They weren't written by eyewitnesses of the apostles. And they don't agree with what the apostles themselves wrote. Therefore, these books were never used in the early Christian church, which again, point 3 and 4 of the criteria for something to be considered Scripture, there had to be universal acceptance, there had to be liturgical use. These books, as I said, were written in the mid-2nd century to early 4th century. They have no apostolic authority. They contain unorthodoxy. They were never accepted. Now, getting back to our timeline after that little brief interlude, we move to the year 1782. Robert Aitken's Bible is printed in the United States. It's the first English Bible, and it is a King James Version printed in America. Those of you who went into the Truth Project, I put this for you. Del Tackett mentioned the Noah Webster quite a bit. Did you know that Noah Webster himself rewrote the King James Version, and he prints a revision of it in 1833. In 1885, the English Revised Version of the Bible is the first major revision of the King James Version. And in 1901, the American Standard Version is the first major American revision of the King James Version. In 1971, we have the beginning of the latest revisions, the latest translations, and the first is the New American Standard Bible. It was published as, and I quote, a modern and accurate word-for-word English translation of the Greek and of the Hebrew. The whole idea here was, let's go back to the very beginning and make sure what we have in English is extremely accurate. The problem is, Greek and Hebrew does not always easily lend itself to good English reading. And so the New American Standard Bible was a little difficult to read. So 2 years later, the New International Version is published, and it was a, quote, modern and accurate phrase-for-phrase English translation. It takes the Greek, it takes the Hebrew, and instead of putting it exactly word for word, which doesn't always line up well and is not always understandable, it takes the context of the sentence, the phraseology of the Greek, and puts it into English phraseology that we would understand and would be easier to read. In 1982, the New King James Version is published as, again I quote, a modern and accurate version maintaining the original style of the King James. People like the these and the thys and the thous. So those things were retained. But it went and became much more accurate in terms of following the actual Greek and the Hebrew. Please remember that original King James Version was really a revision of the Bishop's Bible. If you took a Bishop's Bible and compared it to the King James Version, you will find that over 2/3 of it is word for word the same. And the latest, in the year 2002, the English Standard Version is published as a translation to bridge the gap between the accuracy of the New American Standard Bible and the readability of the NIV Bible. Well, now that kind of leads to the question. With so many versions, is the Bible reliable? With all these different versions, hasn't it changed? And really, how many Bibles are there? Well, let me say the Bible is completely reliable, and contrary to modern claims in the movies, media, or selected books that it has been changed, it has remained remarkably unchanged.